Hello and welcome to AWS Bites Live. This is usually the weekly show where we do around 5 minutes of a weekly update answering questions on AWS. But this is our second live during reInvent show. So if you're not already subscribed to the YouTube channel on youtube.com/AWS Bites. And then you get weekly updates and more live announcements. We might do a lot more specials like this. And if you are more of an auditory consumer of content, you can go to the podcast page. So on our website, awsbites.com, you'll see a whole list of links to all the different platforms and how you can listen to the podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and everything else. And this is our second update show. So Luciano, how are you doing? We also had a show a couple of days ago on the first day, and we've had a whole raft of announcements since then. And I suppose a lot to keep you and I happy, because a lot more services became serverless. So I think there was 5 services that they announced where we had existing services, but you had to provision capacity, and now we've got serverless modes. So do you want to talk about some of these? What ones were your favorites?
Yeah, well, first of all, before going into that, I just want to say that there was really a huge amount of announcements, and it feels like it's very hard to keep up with all of them. Like, it feels like I have a big to-do list that is getting bigger and bigger on things I really want to check out and actually play with, rather than just talking about.
True.
But I mean, for lack of time, we are just going to try to give our impressions, even though we might not have tried all the new announcements. Regarding serverless, there were a few interesting ones. I'm just going to go through the list. And we had Kinesis on-demand data streams, which
Finally.
maybe not really serverless, but we'll discuss that in a second. Then we have Redshift serverless MSK, serverless EMR, and Sagemaker serverless inference. I'm going to drop the links in the chat.
Yep.
But yeah, what do you think about the Kinesis on-demand data stream? Because it doesn't feel like serverless at least by my definition, but it's still maybe a step forward in that direction.
Yeah, on Sunday when we did our wish lists, we mentioned that we were wishing for Kinesis on demand, but it's a bit strange, right? So some of these services say serverless in the title, some of them say on demand, and I don't really know what the logic is behind that, because if we look at MSK, the managed streaming for Kafka, there's a serverless mode for that, and they use the word serverless. Kinesis is called on demand, a bit like DynamoDB. But in both cases, there's a base rate you pay for. So even if you're not using the service, if you're not passing any data through the streams, there's a per hour charge. So they don't scale down to zero cost, which is unfortunate. I think it's a pity. You still have that minimum cost there. And I saw for Kinesis, Andreas Wittig on Twitter did an analysis of pricing of on-demand versus provisioned for Kinesis, and showed that in a lot of cases it's still going to be more expensive to use the serverless option than provisioning. So it looks like this is aimed at people who are just have very bursty and unpredictable traffic patterns in their streams, but it's not like, I think provisioning Kinesis is always a good idea anyway. Like if you have especially if you're using Lambdas at the consumption side, it makes sense to provision your clusters and know exactly how many shards, so you know exactly how many invocations you're getting. If you've got a unpredictable number of shards, then you can get an unpredictable, non-deterministic behavior in your Lambdas. It's not necessarily a good thing. So it's a good step in the right direction for Kinesis, but not necessarily the utopia we hoped for with scale down to zero and everything else. But
which
it's still a good thing.
For many people, that's kind of the definition of serverless, when you can scale down to zero. If you're not using it, you're not paying for it. So that's kind of lacking a little bit for that to be considered really a serverless improvement. But still, probably good for certain use cases, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Now, EMR serverless sounds really good. You don't pay for anything when you're not using it. You pay by the vCPUs when you're running. So I think that's really, really good for EMR. Of course, it's also gives you like a number of ways to do the same thing in AWS. Like a lot of these announcements, it just gives you more choice, which isn't always a good thing. But EMR serverless and Glue now have a significant overlap, because Glue already gave you, a serverless. They call it serverless ETL, but it's really like serverless Spark or serverless Python shell for data processing and transformation. You could do the same thing in EMR, but EMR gives you a few more options if you want to use, Presto or Hive or various other tools that Glue doesn't support.
Yeah, the other one we have here in this list is SageMaker Serverless, which, I mean, it looks like you don't have to manually start and stop containers as you used to do before, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you spend more time. Yeah.
I have spent a bit of time used with SageMaker endpoints, and they could be, as one of the 19 ways to run a container on AWS. SageMaker endpoints, they could be very slow to provision sometimes. So it's really, really inflexible. And in some cases, we ended up switching to Lambda to do the inference, because you don't often need a Docker container or a SageMaker or a GPU to do inference. Sometimes CPU is, in a lot of cases, actually, CPU is fine. So SageMaker inference serverless is a good thing, but I'd still probably be using Lambda if I could. But maybe one of the most impressive ones in this list is the Redshift one, because serverless data warehouses, it seems like a brave new world almost. The ability to be able to bring up data warehouse and scaling Redshift, I think, has been problematic, ensuring that it can scale in all the right dimensions and adapt to lots of concurrent queries on large data volumes. So I am definitely interested to try that out and hear how people get on with it.
Does that scale to 0 or not?
It's a good question. I haven't checked with Redshift. Maybe somebody can let us know in the comments or on Twitter.
Yeah, we definitely need to check that, because that will be interesting to see. And there has been a push from other vendors. Like, I know CockroachDB not long ago, I think it was a couple of months ago, announced a similar approach to basically have a serverless version of their database. So it's interesting to see that, of course, AWS is trying to keep up and cover this space as much as they can. Okay, the interesting thing that we had in our list, in our wish list, that we haven't seen yet is a serverless Redis. I think there is still hope, but hasn't been announced yet. So I just wanted
fingers
to
crossed.
that.
I think if that was announced, it might be my favorite.
Probably, yeah. Okay, on a similar topic, there were a couple of interesting news around Lambda. So maybe do we want to talk about that? Well, one is not really an official news, right? It's the Lambda ephemeral storage pre-announcement. There was a tweet by Julian Wood. I'm going to put the URL in the chat. But yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, Julian Wood's tweet was a screen, a picture of a TV, or like digital signage from AWS that showed that ephemeral storage is coming up. And I think he followed up in the thread to say that you would be able to configure functions for up to 10 gigabytes of ephemeral storage from the current max of 500 megs. So that's definitely a great thing. I mean, it's still ephemeral storage, so it's not like the EFS option, but it gives you a lot of power and flexibility, because there's some cases where you're processing a lot of data and you need to keep, for example, model data for machine learning workloads is just one example. I'm sure there's lots more where you need temporary file system storage, and it's almost like the last restriction in Lambda that stops people using the service for a lot of workloads. I mean, I know that there are others, like 15 minutes of time, etc. But it's just another reason to adopt Lambda now when this comes out. But we don't know when it's going to come out yet. There's no date.
Yeah, we mentioned in our wish list that it would be nice to be able to do like video editing in a Lambda, assuming you would also get GPU. I think something like this could also be another enabler to that use case, because of course you can be able to process larger files at that point. Okay, then we have the SQS redrive. I'm going to try to find a link for this one, but I'm not really sure I am prepared enough to talk about that, so I'll leave it to you.
So this was one, I just came across this one this morning. I'm not sure when the announcement came, but the idea is with SQS, you have a dead letter queue feature, so you can pop undelivered messages into a queue. Previously, you would have to implement your own redrive logic, or if you just wanted to wing it, you could go into the AWS console and retrieve messages and redrive them yourself. But this gives you an interface to be able to inspect messages in the dead letter queue and choose to redrive them back into the main queue. And I think it's a nice feature. It's actually something I'd like to see for Lambda DLQs and failure destinations as well. I mean, it would be nice to see a broader DLQ support across all services, so that you've got somewhere to just dump your failed messages, and then a nice convenient interface to be able to discover them. It might fit into CloudWatch, and you could alarm on it, and then you could start inspecting them, partitioning them, and redriving traffic as you resolve problems.
Yeah, because all these things are always possible, but every time it feels you are reinventing the wheel by recreating all this glue code to enable all these functionalities.
Yep, DLQ boilerplate all over the place.
Exactly. Yeah, another, let's say, complaint or wish list that is still there that wasn't been announced yet is, in the context of Lambda, would be support for the Rust runtime, because it's a language I'm playing a lot with lately, and it is somewhat supported by AWS, meaning they give you a library that will compile to a binary that is already structured as a Lambda runtime, so that the amount of work is quite minimal, but still you need to do a lot of dancing around the compiler and files copying. It doesn't feel like as natural as it should be. For instance, with Go, it's just much simpler. So hopefully, given that AWS seems to be quite involved with Rust and even the Rust Foundation, they will start to support more Rust in their normal AWS services as a user as well. And another
I've seen a few cold start benchmarks recently that show some amazing results from Rust. So I think it definitely makes a lot of sense for people who are trying to squeeze every millisecond out of that.
Yeah, another thing that I am seeing in other cloud providers is this idea of running Rust even inside Kubernetes using WASM. And it's not too far off from what Cloudflare is actually doing and has been doing for a while now, which is basically you are capable of just shipping as a WASM binary. And because the characteristics of WASM are already isolating the process, you don't even need containers. And that allows you to basically bootstrap application much faster in the context of serverless or even Kubernetes. So that's maybe something, hopefully we'll get some additional announcement in the next days. But yeah, I was hoping for something like that, and it hasn't come yet.
Just out of curiosity on that, Luciano, what is the relative performance of Rust running on WebAssembly versus running bare metal when you compile it to machine code? Is there a big difference there, or should it be roughly similar?
I guess it's a very good question. I don't really have any benchmark in mind. I can give you my expectation, but totally based on feelings and not really on data. That basically Rust, for the way that compiles and the way it's built as a language, it doesn't add any, let's say, abstraction cost. So it tries to compile to the bare minimum that you need to do to actually represent a given feature. For instance, Go in that sense is different because Go has garbage collection. So every time you compile even an hello world, they include a bunch of stuff that manages all the memory and things that you didn't have to write in the first place. So Rust tries to be closer to the metal. I don't really know how well WebAssembly can kind of keep up with that mental model, but I feel that Rust will produce better WebAssembly, for instance, than Go or other compiled languages.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay, that was a little bit of a
tangent.
Off track here.
That's okay. Sagemaker and AI/ML. Should we talk about some of the machine learning announcements, of which there have been many? I had a quick play with Sagemaker Studio Lab. Did you manage to take a look at this one, Luciano? I mean, you mentioned some things you've seen before that kind of already do this, but it's the first time we've seen it. I guess what was excited here. So let's maybe define it first. Sagemaker Studio Lab is a notebook environment that you can use independent of having any AWS account. You don't need an AWS account. You can sign up for it. You can link it into GitHub code, and it will give you time-limited notebooks that you can use to experiment and learn with machine learning and data science projects. I think that's a pretty good thing for people who are learning. I think the CPU notebooks shut down after 12 hours. The GPU ones shut down after 4 hours. So that's the restriction. But this kind of thing is, I suppose, it's interesting for AWS because it's nice to see them do something that doesn't require a credit card and an AWS account, and to, allow, I suppose, democratize these things a little bit. But they're kind of also playing catch up in a certain sense. They exist in other services.
Yeah, for instance, it's not necessarily similar. I think Google has something that is a little bit more general purpose, which is Google Colab, which essentially allows you to spin up a notebook, a Jupyter notebook, very easily, even well integrated with Google Drive, for instance. If that's something you are using in your organization, it will literally look as a file in your Google Drive. And when you open it, you have an entire Jupyter notebook ready to play with. And that's a nice way for you to share experiments with other people. And I suppose for students, it could be a very nice environment to learn and experiment without having to be necessarily worried about how much is it going to cost me. Do I need to set up, I don't know, all sorts of alarms because maybe I have a budget and I don't want to overcome that particular budget. So that sounds really interesting. At the same time, I wanted to try it, but then there is like a whole sign up that you need to do and request access. So I kind of gave up at that point. But I suppose it's going to get easier. I think the premise is good. We just need to allow AWS a little bit of time to continue on this path. Okay.
We got
then. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. On SageMaker again, one of the interesting ones I suppose to see was Ground Truth Plus, and this is all about labeling training data, which is a big problem for people I think who are doing deep learning or any kind of machine learning application. And it's about getting your training data labeled correctly so that you can run training and then produce good models. And Ground Truth, I think, has been there for a year or so, which is a service that allows you to support labeling workflows. You can imagine if you've got a library of medical images and you need people to annotate images that have problems, that have some sort of diagnosis or some sort of finding associated with them. You're looking for features and you need trained professionals to label it. There's all sorts of cases for this across machine learning workflows. But previously, I think you had to bring your own kind of workforce to that problem, or you could use Amazon Turk. Now that's kind of built into Ground Truth Plus, so they will provide what they call an expert workforce that is trained and specialist in labeling machine learning data sets, and they'll also use some machine learning to automate that process. So it's kind of like a human in the loop service for labeling. So that seems pretty interesting. I'm keen to see how people get on with that one.
Yeah.
Was there anything else in the AI ML space that interested you?
One that I found interesting is the Amazon Lex automated chatbot designer. I haven't used it yet, but what I understood from the announcement is that basically if you want to build a chatbot, rather than starting from scratch, you could feed the system with a bunch of historical conversations. Maybe, I don't know, if you have a customer service, you can take all that information from the conversation with the customer service, and that system will try to infer, for instance, what are the main topics, what are the main questions, what were the common answers. And from that, you should get kind of a blueprint that allows you to build a chatbot that is already fine-tuned for your specific use cases. That seems pretty interesting because, as far as I know, this is one of the main problems with chatbots, that in theory, the technology itself is not extremely complicated, but in practice, it's very hard to find like how do I fine tune that experience to my actual data, the actual needs of my customer, and that takes a while before you get it right. So if you have historic data, now you can do a few steps forwards by just feeding this data to the system. So that sounds very interesting. Hopefully it is actually accurate, because that's, of course, where the devil is in the detail, right? If you get something accurate enough, then you get a lot of value. If it's totally inaccurate, yeah, you're still on your own to do all the fine tuning.
Yeah, that looks pretty good. And the last one I noticed from the AI announcements is something quite different, which is the scholarship program for people from, I suppose, backgrounds, like diverse backgrounds or less privileged backgrounds, to be able to get into the field of AI and machine learning, which is something that's clearly desperately needed. And I suppose it's good to see the start of this from AWS, and hopefully more of it across the whole industry to support the diversification of not just AI and ML, but cloud and software in general.
Absolutely. And I think that there was a little bit of a recurring topic in some announcements, even during the keynote. So it's good to see that AWS is not disregarding this topic, that these days is becoming rightfully more and more important, that people have to be more and more aware. So it's good to see also somewhat of an official endorsement from AWS that this problem exists and everyone needs to do something to try to address it.
Yep, exactly. More fingers crossed for a lot more of that.
All right. Do we move to the next section that we have is storage and data, right?
Yeah, I think there were quite a few in this space. DynamoDB infrequent access. So infrequent access is something we had before with S3 and Glacier. What does DynamoDB infrequent access do, right? It's about saving cost if you don't have to pull your data as frequently, right?
Yeah, I suppose it could be useful for all those use cases where maybe you are recording a lot of information for, I don't know what use case, but you want to store it, and very rarely you're going to need to actually read it. So I think in that sense, you could have some good saving, because it's going to be much cheaper to store the data. It's going to be a little bit more expensive to read the data. And I think if you have that kind of balance, you could save money compared to the traditional cost scheme of Dynamo.
Yeah. I think with the guideline in the documentation says something like, if your data storage cost in DynamoDB is exceeding 50% of your data access cost, then you should consider using infrequent access.
Okay, then another one we had in this space, which is somewhat similar, I suppose, is the S3 Glacier instant retrieval and S3 intelligent tiering. I'm going to put the links in the chat. But again, it looks like other ways that you could save money on storage, depending on particular use cases you might have. Basically, the pricing system and the way the information is stored tries to be more optimized to your actual use case, leading you to save a little bit of money. I don't know if you have any other comment on that, Owen.
No, I think it's good to see the more flexibility in this space, and better cost saving options for data storage. There's I think there was also some enhancements to S3 IAM, to just security and adding better error reporting into the console, from what I understand, around potential security problems. That's a good thing. There was also one I know for a fact that is kind of close to your heart, which is S3 object ownership. And previously there was an issue where if you put an object into a bucket in a different account, the bucket owner had to put some special mechanisms in place with ACLs to ensure that they could access it. Do you want to talk about that? Because I think there's a single checkbox now to solve all that, from what I understand.
Yeah, I haven't checked the specifics, but I remember that I had to deal with this, and not too much far away, right? It was a couple of months ago, I think. But the idea makes sense. It's basically I am authorized to write in a bucket, so you can set up all this configuration so that from an account you can write to a bucket in another account. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the owner of the other account can easily read those files, which I suppose it could make sense. Maybe there are use cases where you might not want, just because you are writing into somebody else's bucket, to just give away all that control. But at the same time, I think most of the use cases you actually want, you are writing to somebody else's bucket because you want to give data to another account, right? So it was a little bit annoying that you needed to do all this dance of setting up ACL and policies on both sides to kind of propagate these permissions all around from both parties. So it seemed a little bit unnecessary, even though it's still coherent with the philosophy of AWS, where everything is forbidden by default and you need to enable the things that you really want to enable.
Yeah.
But I suppose,
it simplifies it a lot, I think. Yeah. This basically, from what I understand, this bucket level setting is something you can turn on. It's called object level ownership. And it means that basically it disables ACLs for the bucket and says every object in this bucket is going to be owned by the bucket owner. And just makes the whole process a bit simpler.
Yeah, and it's still explicit enough, I guess. Like you still need to enable it. It's not going to happen by default. Okay.
That's right, yeah. I was just before, I don't know if you wanted to mention anything else on data and storage. There were a couple of announcements around lake formation, which is kind of a strange umbrella service. It's kind of a service in its own right, but it built on top of things like S3 and Glue Data Catalog and Athena. So one announcement was around security. So it allows you to have row and column level security for data stored in the data lake, which is very cool for granular access. And the other thing was governed tables. So governed tables, and this is achieved through Glue and Glue Catalog, but it means that you have, again, the other day we were talking about Athena and support for Apache Iceberg, ACID transactions. Governed tables allows you to get ACID transaction support through lake formation, and then you can do things like time traveling, so you can do queries on your data in the data lake at a specific point in time, and it has other things like automatic data compaction. So I think it's interesting to see where lake formation goes, because it's not necessarily a coherent service, because it's almost like a puppeteer for other services, but it's something that's obviously competitively very important, because there's so much evolution in the commercial data lake and data management space.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving on, another interesting category of announcements is around cloud migrations. And in particular, there are two that I found interesting, even though they were not particularly hyped, but they could be really interesting. One is basically I'm not sure if they call it mainframe modernization or something like that, but it's basically a feature that allows you to automatically convert COBOL applications to Java and deploy them to AWS, which is interesting because we know, we have been in the industry long enough to see still so many companies using COBOL on a mainframe and find it very, very hard to move on from that I think AWS is trying to sweep also all these potential customers and bring them on board. And I think that could be a good solution if it delivers on the promise, right? If it can really give you good enough code that you can start to work with, and it can really bring you to the cloud, and then you can start to improve from there, it could work. I am somewhat skeptical because I think it's a very hard problem, but I haven't tried, so I don't know.
Well, I'm interested to see. I'm sure there are a lot of people in financial institutions across the world who are excited to see that and interested to try it. And there was another slightly related, but maybe not as when we're talking about legacy stacks, we're not going back so far to as to the COBOL era, but there was something announced for people with .NET applications that are unwieldy monoliths, and you and I spent a lot of time in analyzing monoliths and refactoring them and for cloud migration. So would you like to say a little bit more about this and what it's trying to bring to the world?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting problem, because even at Fortiorem internally we have done some research in this front. But I suppose that the problem that this particular service is trying to solve is whenever you are trying to do this process of moving away from a monolith and converting it to a microservices architecture, it takes a little bit of time, and it's not it's rarely kind of a clear path to understand what are the actual microservices that you need to build. Like, how do you decouple? What are the main domains that you really have to define and then start to deconstruct into those domains? And I think here the idea is somewhat similar to what we did in our research, which is basically by observing the behavior of the application at runtime, but also by observing it statically just by looking at the code, you can get enough information to have something like a blueprint that can guide you to at least get the first few steps done. Then I assume you still need a lot of the human support there to see what's the output of that process and decide what really makes sense and what doesn't. But it's definitely going to speed up the process a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I wonder, will it evolve into more? Obviously, this is support for .NET. You'd expect to see Java support, I guess, as well, and support for other monoliths, of which there are many. So I think we've covered quite a lot here, Luciano. Any special mentions before we wrap up?
So special mentions, one that was interesting to see, and it was during the keynote, so it was very well hyped announcement, is Graviton 3, which seems to be very interesting from a performance perspective, but also energy saving perspective, which also ties in with another announcement, which is the carbon footprint tool. So again, AWS seems to be supporting another important topic of our last few years, which is how do we make sure that everything we do has a better carbon footprint, or is more green, if you want to say it that way.
Yep, and it's you can look at this one with optimistic or a skeptical eye, or both, I guess, because we're all conscious of large corporations greenwashing as well, and we know that data centers are a serious emitter. Now, that's as I understand the figures are that data centers emit more than the airline industry globally, and they're growing at a faster rate. But I guess one thing is the other side of that is, okay, so there's a couple of things there, and there's a couple of good talks I've seen from Paul Johnson, who's very interested in this space and the intersection between climate change and cloud and technology. And one of the points he always enforces is if you try not to build systems that we don't need, which is, I think, a good rule for us all to follow. This is the first thing. You don't need to reduce what you don't have. But beyond that, cloud should give us an opportunity to have more efficient utilization, right? So less idle time, fewer instances and storage clusters and machines and data centers that are sitting there doing nothing. And hopefully, at least with the move towards serverless and efficient compaction of CPU resources, that will actually make a difference too. So I think it's good to see this. I think it's really interesting for people to know what their carbon footprint is. I mean, people have an obligation to know as well for regulatory reasons. So I'm definitely keen to keep an eye on this and see what else Amazon are going to do. I think they need to do a lot more in terms of data center efficiency. A lot of what they do in terms of improving their sustainability image is still in terms of buying offsets rather than in necessarily seriously investing in green energy. So I'm interested to watch this. having a carbon footprint tool when it arrives will give people a lot more awareness of this, which is a good thing because people need to be aware and have data behind stuff before they can really take action. So I'm glad to see that.
Yeah, and I will be interesting. I don't know if it's something that is already in the roadmap or already somewhat supported by AWS, but it will be interesting to have a tool that can tell you, like at a service level, in a company having a cloud deployment, how are you impacting this kind of thing? So maybe you can also revisit in the company strategy, like, do we really need this service or can we rewrite it? Can we do something else to reduce our carbon emission because we are deploying this particular cloud service? So that could
Yep.
be an interesting thing to see. And one last thing that I'm not an expert at all, I just want to mention it because I think it kind of ties into this conversation, is the private 5G service, which is an entirely new service. And one of the use cases that I heard people mentioning is you want to do an event, you're probably going to maybe want to go in an area that doesn't really have a good coverage. You could get AWS to come in and basically provide you with a 5G infrastructure that is kind of disposable. Like you don't need to do a huge investment and create a permanent infrastructure. You just use it when you need it. So I think it ties in a little bit with this topic of let's not build permanent things if we don't need them. We just use it when we need it. If we don't need it anymore, maybe we'll move it somewhere else and kind of have it as a service only when needed.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. It was a big feature of the keynote, wasn't it, with the dish participation and everything. So yeah, and it's also a departure for Amazon, I guess, or they're moving it. Like I know we've had things like ground station for satellites. It seems like it's more like low level services, and just really AWS flexing their muscles and reaching into new spaces like core telecoms infrastructure. So today is the day when we get Werner Vogel's keynote. That's happening in a few hours, and I think it'll be interesting to watch. I think it's great to have. I've heard that Matt Coulter from Liberty Mutual in Belfast is participating on that on stage, which is really good because I mean, for us it's good to see somebody from close by who's really pushing the boundaries in serverless and CDK and all the great stuff they're doing up there. So I'm really happy to see that they're participating, and I'm really keen to see what we learn from it because I think there's some really great enterprise serverless examples from that company and from WorkGrid as well. So I'd recommend tuning into that.
Yeah, that's a great shout out for sure.
Okay, well, I think that's pretty much a wrap for what we've got today. We won't have the usual Friday AWS Bites this week because we're already inundating you with extra content and live shows. So I think we'll let people either take a much needed break or catch up on some of the great AWS reInvent talks. But we will be back next week and we'll conclude reInvent and do a bit of a retrospective and talk about our highlights. So in the meantime, please share this with your friends and family, and also subscribe to the YouTube channel and spread the word, and also give us plenty of feedback as well. If you like these long formats or the short formats, I've heard mixed feedback from people already, but we really want to know what works best for everyone out there. Okay, so thanks very much for joining today, and we will catch you the next time.
Bye.